Okay, cool. So I'm going to give a talk this evening on humility and leadership. So this is the theme that Brad gave me, and apologies for the talk. Like I said, I think Brad and Mara were kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel a little bit. So hopefully I do all right. And again, very much a big thank you to our hosts this evening as well, both Charlie and Molly. So I want to start off with talking about what does secular leadership look like, at least as we think of it in a historical context. And so what have pictured here are a variety of leaders that might come to mind when somebody says, well, name a leader from history. Name somebody that's... I was going to say, yeah. I wasn't quite sure if somebody was going to recognize him. So we have Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, Cleopatra, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, and Napoleon. All these men and women accomplished, great, but also really terrible things in their lifetime. They've united empires, they've conquered vast lands, they united very diverse peoples, and yet they did this all through raw power and intimidation. None of these men or women really solidified their power through any type of humility, any type of treaties, any type of understanding of different perspectives or different cultures. And so today we still have this kind of same mentality of, hey, go out, do what you want to do by any means necessary. Don't be a sheep. Don't be part of the herd. Go out, strike out on your own. And you'll even hear this term sheeple thrown around quite a bit nowadays. Don't be a sheep. Don't be a sheeple. Don't go with the herd. Go out on your own. And yet this message really doesn't resonate with us as Christians or as Catholics, because we commonly refer to ourselves as sheep, following a shepherd. And so you have this image of, are we really mindless sheep? Are we really following someone just on our way to a slaughter? And so this verse from John was read a few weeks ago. It's just part of the liturgy where, again, we as sheep are recognizing our shepherd's voice, where we're, being called to follow him. And yet this calling to be a sheep, to be a follower of Jesus and of Christ, is so counterintuitive, especially in today's culture. And so this is a real quote that was said to me by a coworker, where they had said, hey, Christianity is just like a mainstream cult. Christians are just stupid cult members that are following an outdated leader and outdated ideas. But what I want to really do tonight is kind of flip that script, where we not think of ourselves as sheep, but think of ourselves more as a ram. And so although I've titled this talk of leadership and humility, I'd really like to also call it of sheep and rams. And so I like this image here of a sheep out in the battlefield with his little helmet strapped on, just ready to go. And so we've talked about just some of these leaders that come to mind of, secular, in a secular world or in a pagan culture. But I want to contrast that a little bit with some leaders that come to mind from our own faith tradition. So we have, Joshua and the walls of Jericho collapsing. We have St. Joseph. We have Joan of Arc. We have David. We have St. Longinus. So that is the centurion that actually pierced the side of Christ. And then when the blood and water flowed into his eyes, he regained his sight. And then the two figures on the right are personal favorites of mine. So there's St. Augustine. And so oftentimes you'll see this image of him with a burning heart. But in this particular painting of him, he's actually being confronted by a demon, and he is presented with this book of sins. And the demon is showing him all the sins that Augustine has committed. And so the story goes, he went back to the chapel, confessed all his sins, and then came back out to meet the demon head on. And the lower right there is, of course, St. Michael the Archangel, where his name, Michael, literally means who is like God. So in perpetuity, he will always be, rebuking anyone that tries to compare themselves to the glory of God. And so these are, some of the leaders that have existed in God's flock. Now, none of these figures I would say are anywhere close to a sheep. These are all, you know, men and women that I would not want to trifle with. And so, you know, there's this huge history. This is just a smattering of some of these really impressive rams that have existed in God's flock throughout history. And so I can't talk, obviously, about all of these figures. And so I wanted to talk about two in particular. So I want to talk about Moses tonight. And then also this, you know, really interesting guy, Father Ciszek, was a Catholic priest that was imprisoned in the Soviet Union. And so both of these figures, one from scripture and one, you know, very recent priest, both of these figures really demonstrate how to be a leader, but also to do it in an incredibly humble way with their eyes towards fulfilling God's will. And so I want to start with Moses. So there was this statue of Moses done by Michelangelo, and this is commonly referred to as one of Michelangelo's ugliest statues. And that's really because of these weird horns that you see on Moses's head. And so, you know, at the time, this Christian monk Jerome was translating the Old Testament from Hebrew and translating it in from Greek into Latin, and we got the Vulgate translation out of this. Now, anytime you do a translation, especially way back in the 4th century, you made some mistakes. And so, in the original Hebrew, the way that they used to describe Moses' change in appearance after he had seen God was to say that he had rays of light. Now, Jerome mistranslated this as to say literally his face was horned. And so for 1200 years, anytime that Moses was either sculpted or painted, you'll see either rays of light coming out of his head or even horns in this example. And so I think, you know, sometimes those mistakes still interestingly speak to a deeper truth. In this case, Moses being just a ram, this guy that did amazing, great things. And so, you know, Moses is commonly referred to as the lawgiver, you know, and he did these enormous things, parting the Red Sea, giving his people the Ten Commandments after receiving that from God. So I think these are the two big highlights everybody kind of knows. But these events really don't speak to the very human, humble Moses and some of the just key small details of his life that are so often overlooked. And so what I want to present instead is not Moses that is parting the Red Sea, not Moses that is leading his people through the desert for 40 years. I want to go through some of the little small details that are so easily missed that you'll often see in Deuteronomy or Numbers, or these little one-off verses in Exodus. So I think it's really funny. So in Numbers, Numbers is commonly attributed to Moses as the author. And so there's this verse here that says, "Now Moses was very humble, more than any other man on the face of the earth." So I always think it's a little funny that Moses was perhaps writing about his own immense humility. But with that aside, there's some really small but very powerful and moving examples of this man's humility. And so, for instance, in one chapter, there's a bunch of judges that he's appointed, and they start prophesying down in the camp. And so Joshua comes to Moses and says, "Hey, you gotta stop these people from prophesying." And Moses turns to Joshua and says, "I wish all men had the Spirit of God like these men do." So Moses was not interested at all in being the only one that had communication with God. He wasn't concerned about his reputation. He wasn't concerned about being the center of attention. His whole objective was to spread God throughout the camp, through all his people. There's this other great example, again, from Numbers, where Miriam is getting a little jealous, and she starts to gossip and say, you know, maybe the people should be following us instead of Moses. And so God actually strikes her with leprosy as a punishment for complaining and, you know, essentially telling her this is what you get for being so self-righteous, for attacking your own flesh and blood, especially your own sibling that have chosen to lead this Hebrew people. Now, Moses could have gloated. He could have said, aha, Miriam, look at what you get. Maybe next time don't talk about me behind my back. But that's not what he did. Instead, he cried out to God, please heal my sister of this leprosy that you've stricken her with. And then God, in his mercy, grants Moses' request. But I think about my own sibling. If he had gotten hurt by doing something stupid, I might not have been so quick to say, oh man, I feel sorry for you. No, I might have gloated a little bit in his kind of suffering. But Moses doesn't do that at all. And then there's this other great example. All the people keep coming to Moses. They're constantly complaining about how their life is so difficult and there's never enough food, there's never enough water. They're constantly squabbling among themselves. And they keep coming to Moses because he's the man with authority. He's the only guy that really has any authority at this point in the story. And so Moses starts to complain. And so his father-in-law, Jethro, this pagan Midian priest, turns to Moses and says, hey, look, you should go appoint some judges, some officials. That way you can disperse your authority and you don't have people coming to you all the time. Now, that's great advice, but it's also coming from his father-in-law. And so what Moses could have said is, hey, look, Jethro, mind your own business. You're, a pagan priest. Who do you think you are telling me to run, this new people, and, can you imagine too, if Jethro had said this in front of not only Moses, but if his wife had been standing there? That could have been so embarrassing to have, your father-in-law come there and try to give you advice and kind of show you up. But Moses, again, doesn't turn to Jethro in anger. He doesn't try to say, hey, mind your own business. Instead, he takes the advice as clearly as he could. And he's like, oh, that's actually great advice. And then I think this last example is really what I think is one of the most moving parts of Exodus. And so the Israelites are in battle really for one of the first time in the desert. They're these new people. They still squabble. They still don't like each other. And yet they have to fight as a unit. They have to fight for their own survival. And so Moses is up on the hill, and as he raises his arms, the Israelites start to succeed. But every time he lets his arms fall, they start to lose. And so his brother Aaron and Hur start to see that Moses is struggling. I don't know if you've ever held your arms up trying to hold something for somebody, whether it's a piece of wood or you're just trying to hold something above your head. Your arms get surprisingly tired surprisingly quickly. And so Moses here is trying to preserve his people. He's appealing to God, and yet his arms keep sagging and they keep losing. Until his friends come along and actually lift his arms up. And they do this for hours until sunset, until Joshua finally leads the army to victory. But this is, I think, really one of the most moving parts of Exodus, because Moses essentially invites in Aaron and Hur into that suffering to say, yes, guys, I really actually need help here. Now, Aaron and Hur could have said, hey, Moses, you're kind of a smelly goat herder. We can go get some pieces of wood, prop your arms up. But they don't do that. They actually physically hold his arms up really close to him for hours through the desert heat until sunset, until they actually win. And so I think this, again, is just a great example, and an example that's often overlooked in Scripture, of Moses' profound humility. Yes, he was this great leader, both diplomatically and also a great military leader. But what is so impressive about him is not those military victories. It's not leading his people through the Red Sea. It's the fact that he exhibited great humility in circumstances that we might ourselves face, whether it's, a father or a mother-in-law, giving you some advice and you're not quite sure that you want to hear them out. It might be a sibling squabbling with you, or it might be, you're not quite sure that you want your friends to see your weaknesses, that you can't really hold up that piece of wood above your head that long. And yet Moses shows us in all these really very typical ways of how you can humble yourself, and how those small little actions had profound consequences. And so I want to then flip from this great figure in Scripture to a kind of more recent example. So there was this young boy, Walter Ciszek, who was incredibly strong-willed youth, to say the least. He would go on to be a Catholic priest, but it wasn't looking like he was ever going to be anything of note. So as a youth, he was constantly problematic, picking fights, missing school, completely ignoring any type of advice he got from his parents. Discipline was having no effect well into his teenage years. So his father, this hardworking Polish immigrant, just was so frustrated with his son and had no idea what to do with him. And then suddenly Walter decides, you know what, I'm going to be a priest. And everybody was just shocked. They're like, why would this kid that's always getting into trouble, that we can't get a handle on him, why does he want to be a priest? And yet, despite, really having no great reason, nobody could quite figure out what is driving this kid, Walter goes off to be a seminary in Michigan. And again, he continues to be a problem. He's not like this, any sort of priest of renown. He's not this guy where everybody looks to him to say, hey, look, this is going to be a great priest someday. In fact, everybody thought that he was, again, just a nuisance and a problem, constantly getting into arguments, picking fights. And then Walter was doing himself no favors. He was not exactly the most pious of seminarians. And so he had this idea that he had to prove himself, that he was always trying to prove how tough he was, so he would undertake these stupid practices of swimming in the icy lake, or during Lent he would only eat bread and water. And again, this wasn't out of any desire to be pious. This wasn't out of a desire to suffer like Jesus in the desert. No, this was all about showing off. This was all about showing that he could be, better than his fellow seminarians. And so even his superiors were warning him, hey, look, this is impacting your health. We have some questions about your motivations. But again, Walter kind of ignored them all until he got a little bit further down in his career. And again, this man, for whatever reason, was so driven. He had to do hard things, but his motivations were off. He was doing hard things to prove himself. He wasn't doing hard things for the glory of God. And so there's this one quote that he has from his book that he decided, hey, I'm going to go be a Jesuit because I think this is the hardest thing that I could possibly do. And so I want to go do that. So he didn't pick out being a Jesuit for any type of theological reason, not for any type of fraternal reason. He had this notion of, oh, this looks hard, I want to go do it. And so, again, he just continued to be problematic and all over the place in his theology. He wasn't really aligned to God's will. And so, again, just following the same pattern, he thought, hey, you know what would be really great for me to do? I'm going to go over into Soviet Russia because it's hard. I'm going to go smuggle myself in. And so, this was kind of great, despite his motivations. The Soviets had closed all the seminaries. They had imprisoned bishops and priests. But for 10 years, Walter wasn't able to get himself into Soviet Russia. He wasn't able to really get permissions. Any types of attempts he had to try smuggle himself in really didn't work out until 1940, where finally, after a decade, he was able to smuggle into Russia into a boxcar with Polish laborers headed for a lumber camp. But what was so frustrating is this guy that was overflowing with enthusiasm, overflowing with just zeal and energy, nobody wanted to talk to him. He was so frustrated that nobody wanted to hear about God. Everyone was afraid of communist informers. So he grew increasingly just frustrated and could find no type of outlets for his priestly ministry in Soviet Russia. Even though Soviet Russia desperately needed God, just everyone was too afraid to talk to Walter. And so he decided, you know what, I'm just going to leave. It's God's will that people don't hear me out. But that ended up not being the case. So just as he's about to try to get back out of Soviet Russia, he was arrested as a spy. And as you can imagine, spies are not treated very well in Soviet Russia. And so he is sent to Moscow's dreaded I believe it's pronounced Lubyanka or something very similar, the Lubyanka prison. So this was the KGB's most feared prison, especially in the basement. The floors, it's tough to tell in the photo, but the floors are actually slanted because they had so many mass executions that in order to get all the blood out of the building, the floors had to actually be slanted to drain all the blood from all these men who had been shot and executed and funnel that blood out into the sewage. And so, again, Walter has this great zeal, all this energy, but he's also so misaligned with the will of God. He's not willing to submit himself to really what God is asking of him. He thinks he can do everything himself. No humility whatsoever. And so he writes about how he thought he could stand up to Soviet interrogation techniques. He's like, oh, I pray, I'm firm in my faith. But he was subjected to torture, physical, mental, constantly drugged, never knew quite what was going on, what was real, what was unreal. And then eventually he just collapsed. He eventually signed some papers suggesting, yes, indeed, I am a Vatican spy. But that didn't let him off the hook. So he kept being tortured, interrogated, and finally he fell into this deep despair that he just couldn't get himself out of. And then he finally breaks, and he has this really beautiful moment in the prison where he pleads to God saying, yes, I really am helpless. Yes, I really can't do this myself. And so this is a direct quote I pulled out of his book that he wrote about his experiences. And it really is just this profound conversion moment where he says it was once a death and a resurrection, where his old self that was, enthusiastic, yes, but also so misguided, where he just was always interested in himself. Finally, he lets go and says, God, help me, please. I can't do this myself. And so that really was the turning point for the rest of his life. He, was not suddenly freed, did not suddenly fly out of the Lubyanka prison and start preaching the gospel. He had a long road ahead of him. So the Soviets ended up sentencing him to 15 years of hard labor in the Siberian gulags. So that was not necessarily an upgrade from the KGB's Lubyanka prison. And so, as you can imagine, Siberia, conditions were pretty harsh. So prisoners were starved or worked, poorly housed, poorly clothed. On the low end of the estimate, it's thought that 1.5 million people died trying to push to industrialize that frozen wasteland. But really, after this profound conversion he had in the prison cell, he started doing his priestly duties again. He came out of that deep despair, and this time he started to really take his duties seriously, not for himself, but for the flock that he was charged with taking care of. So for 20 odd years in secret, in these Siberian camps, he would secretly baptize people, hear confessions, tend to the sick and dying, giving homilies in retreats, saying mass, even with what little bread that they had, distributing communion. And all the while, he's still being abused, beaten, tortured by both the Soviet guards, some hardened criminals within those gulags. So within those gulags are political prisoners, yes, innocent people, yes, but also some pretty hardened criminals as well that did not really view a Jesuit priest with any sort of admiration. Rather the opposite. He was hated by a lot of his fellow prisoners, and he bore the consequences of that. Finally, in 1955, after 20-some years in Siberian gulags, he was released from the camps, but still had to stay in Siberia. He was forbidden from moving anywhere else. Finally, he starts to kind of secretly move about the country, continuing to be a nuisance, going around preaching the gospel in all these little Soviet towns where Christianity was essentially outlawed. And the whole time, Soviet police are chasing him from one city to another, trying to track him down. And then through a really weird turn of events, he was unexpectedly released back to the U.S. in 1963. And that release back into the U.S. probably saved his life. But for 20 years, well, for essentially 5 years in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, and then another 20-ish years in Siberia, this man really suffered. But it's really only in the latter part of his prison sentence that he had this great revelation that being a priest meant humbling himself to God and leading these prisoners back to God, even though that did not always end well for him. So he very recently died, and so his cause has been introduced. So his title is currently Servant of God, but within the next few years, we'll see if he'll advance to eventually become a full-fledged sort of saint. And so there's a little organization up in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, that's trying to promote his cause. And so really, his last words still reflect that great conversion he had, where he's telling these Carmelite nuns, at the end of their lives, if they really want to have peace, they need to do God's will every day. And what I think is really beautiful is he tells them to give God's will their lousy best. So he's even acknowledging in this great kind of final act of humility that we can't ever earn a spot. We're totally unworthy. But God is expecting at least our lousy best. And so what does Moses and Father Ciszek say for us here today? What I think these men really say is to not confuse humility with being a passive observer. So, Moses, was he humble? Yes, but he didn't sit in his chair all day just meditating on, his humility and how profound God was. No, he was out in the desert leading this stubborn group of people and trying his damnedest to try to get them to conform to God's will. Same with Father Ciszek. He had this, yes, was he imprisoned? He could have sat there in his prison cell and said, you know what, I'm just going to accept this suffering. But he didn't just accept his suffering. He continued to be a priest. He continued to go out in secret to fulfill his duties. And so what I think both of these really great men tell us to do is to continue to lead and perform our duties, whatever we're called to, even in that suffering, even in the desert. And so, yes, should we be sheep? Absolutely. We should follow Christ. But sometimes we're also called to be a ram, to be a nuisance, to speak up, to continue to fight, even though that's not always so easy. And so I want to kind of close again with a quote by Father Ciszek here, where again, I'm pulling a quote from one of his books, He Leadeth Me, where one of his phrases is, God is essentially important. He knows what sort of moment we're in, but he also knows the things upon which he wants us to act. Again, that we're not meant to just confuse being humble with being passive, with just sitting around, not really doing anything, but just saying, oh, just kind of God's will that I suffer, let me sit here. And so again, I want to pull this quote from Ezekiel, where in this quote, they say, as for you, my flock, says the Lord God, behold, I will judge between one sheep and another, and between the rams and the male goats. So again, calling to mind that, yes, you should be a sheep. But in the right moment, you should also be a ram. And that, God's flock can hold sheep and rams. And different moments will call for different choices. So that's my talk tonight.